What's up, my miners of intelligence and consciousness? I'm Rick Brooks, and this is Rick's Mind. Today with me, I have guest Till Kellerhoff, who's a program director of the Club of Rome. Really hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Welcome to the show, Till. How are you, man?
Hi, Rick. Good to see you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so I think we've got a lot to get into, and there's not a lot of knowledge about what Club Rome is, so I think the best place to start is how you got interested in this, how you got involved, and then what Club Rome is. And I'll kind of flip it to you, and then we can go from there.
Great. Yes, sure. And I acknowledge that Club of Rome is differently known at different places in the world. So I think in Germany, for example, I think it's quite well known, while I know that in the US that's a little bit different. So I got involved with the Club of Rome 5.5 years ago. After uni, I did politics, economics, social science, international relations, and always wanted to do a PhD afterwards and thought maybe 1 year of practical work experience would be nice, and here I am 5 years later, still with the Club of Rome, because I like the kind of combination of research aspects as well as communicating about them, and kind of feel like it's a little bit to give yourself more resonance if you don't just write papers to people read, but can actually speak about it. And that was always the point of the Club of Rome, actually. It was an organization founded in 1968 already. So more than 50 years ago, interestingly, by an Italian industrialist, CEO of Fiat back then, and one of the heads of the OECD. And they noticed something in the world is not going right. And if we look at the future, if we look at the next 100 years, the humanity will face massive challenges. And they started to found this informal organization based on 3 pillars. One is systemic thinking, so looking at the interconnectedness of social, environmental, etc. factors, having a global perspective, and looking at these problems from an interdisciplinary perspective. And so this group came together. It was very much an old white man club back then, that luckily changed by now. And then in 1972, the seminal report, The Limits to Growth, was published, which is until now the most famous report of the Club of Rome.
Absolutely. And Limits to Growth, for people that are unaware, what kind of is that paper about in a nutshell?
Yeah. So interestingly, Dennis Meadows, one of the co-authors, once summarized it, or the reception to it, as millions of people thought it was right, millions of people thought it was wrong, and a few people have actually read the book, because the book actually it had quite some resonance. We estimate that about 10 million copies were sold back then, translated into 30 languages, and the general message was that unlimited material growth on a finite planet is not possible. So the book described different scenarios. It didn't predict anything, which was often a misinterpretation. It looked at different scenarios and what would happen if we behaved that way or that way. What happened if population continued that way, or industrial output that way, or pollution that way. And then looking at this from an interconnected point of view, they came to the conclusion that if the current trends back in the early 70s continued as they were, which basically happened, we would face a decline and collapse mid-20th century. And it's an interesting book, because I think today many people would say, the message is quite clear. I mean, we're transgressing our planetary boundaries. We see climate change, we see biodiversity issues, all these things. We know that by now we would need 1.7 Earth to have a sustainable consumption, which is, we of course don't have it. And still back then, the reception was very critical, also for ideological reasons, I would say. For example, Ronald Reagan famously said, there are no limits to growth because there are no limits to our dreams. And I would say that's already a clear sign of misinterpretation based on ideological reasons.
Yes, absolutely. It does, we ended up, we're at 8 billion now. I believe we just crossed the 8 billion mark of number of humans on the planet. And it's my understanding that it's going to level off, and then we're going to have some population decline. I don't know. You would know more about that. That's just what I'm hearing, right? I haven't looked into it per se. That is correct, right?
That is correct. And I think population is a very tricky topic as well, because very often, especially, people in Europe or the US, if they refer to, population growth is the biggest problem of our time, and then very often refer to kind of African countries who get too many children. And I think that's partly even racist and partly a big misinterpretation of what's actually going on. Because if you look at the material footprint, at what we consume as world citizens, probably the three of us consume way more than people in the poorest countries of the world. So I think population is, of course, an issue. There is a difference if there are 8 billion people on Earth or 12. But I think we have to go a little bit deeper into that. And people who claim like, population growth is the main topic, forget a little bit about the overconsumption of the rich, which I think is the main problem. And in terms of the development, sorry.
No. Go ahead. I was going to say.
Yeah,
continue.
Just briefly in terms of the development, I think that what we see is that birth rates are declining in rich countries due to different factors. Most importantly, it's education for women. If women can have a career and want to have a job and all these things, then this reduces the birth rate already. The other thing is, of course, social security systems and these things. So I think the great thing here is that we have fantastic co-benefits. We need to implement policies like empowerment of women anyways, social security systems anyways, and then we will stabilize the birth rate as well. So we already see that in Germany, I think it's now 1.4. In many industrialized countries, it's lower, and that will equal out. And there are different estimates of when it will equal out. Some would say it's 11 billion in 1100. Some would say it's lower than that and will equal out at 10 billion. That's not 100% predictable, but that there will be a peak at some point in the next decades, that's quite clear.
Yeah. It's, to me, the one thing that, and I definitely believe that we're experiencing climate change, but I think that the cognitive dissonance around like what you see, the let's say I'll use like Leonardo DiCaprio or someone that's famous, they're, screaming about, we all need to change, but it always feels like, no, you guys need to change. I'm going to hop on my private jet. I'm going to get on my yacht and I'm going to just continue doing things, but everyone else needs to change, just not me. And that, I think that is that's where that loses a lot of people, because it's like you're expecting everyone else to make sacrifices, but not yourselves. And I think that that's something that the movement really has to figure out how to overcome. And I don't know how you do that.
Very much, and very good point, because I think that's again the overconsumption of the rich. If you look at who causes the climate crisis, it's like the richest 1% of people in the earth, which is like 60 million people, 63 million, since 1990, emitted more than double the amount of CO2 than the poorest half of world population. So, like the one top percent has a massively over consumption issue there, while most people, don't actually use that much. And I think that this cognitive dissonance definitely comes in there. If you want to have people who say on moral grounds, like we all need to change and fly with a private jet somewhere else, that's of course, doesn't make much sense. And for poor people, it must sound weird because they can't afford their next vacation and are actually happy if they can go to Mallorca once a year, which makes total sense. So what we try to do at the Club of Rome and this Earth4All initiative is to look at the systemic changes, like at policies we need, instead of kind of outsourcing the problem in this neoliberal mindset to the individual and say, like, you now can't fly anymore, you can't eat meat at all, you can't do all these things, and look at what policies are necessary. I think that's one important point. And the other one is really integrating this whole inequality aspect as a crucial part of solving climate change, because exactly for the reasons you say, like there are certain people who are mostly responsible for this, and these are also the ones who need to reduce consumption and take the share of responsibility and actually pay for the transformations we need.
And what kind of policies did you, like, for the people that didn't read the book, what kind of policies did you guys propose in the new book? I believe Earth4All. What? Yeah, if you could kind of let us in on that.
Yeah, so Earth4All was an interesting process because it came together with the help of 30 economists from across the globe and climate scientists from across the globe, and was a 2 years project. And if you would have asked me 2 years ago if we were able to find an agreement, I wouldn't have been so sure, because also in this scene, kind of people have different opinions on certain things. And what we tried to do in Earth4All with the economists and climate scientists, with the help of a computer model, but also other research, was to look at the minimum amount of transformations necessary to achieve something like well-being for all on a relatively stable planet. The important thing for us is this combination of ecological and social factors. So the 5 areas we describe and bring up policies for each of these areas is an energy transformation, because we know that fossil fuel industry is actually the most important thing to combat climate change. The second one is food production, because we know that ever expanding landmass leads to massive problems with biodiversity loss. You know, look at the Amazon rainforest, like just going there and cutting down trees has massive effects on Earth. And then these 2 are kind of the environmental ones. And then we have one which is tackling inequality, because we say that inequality is not only a monetary issue and a normative issue, that we of course want people to have a decent life and benefit from our economic system, which is not always the case. But also because we think that massive inequality in countries leads to an amount of polarization and dysfunctionality that makes it difficult to implement policies that can then fight climate change. The fourth one is fighting poverty. I think this whole debate, this whole climate change debate, needs to look at the poorest in the world. Like otherwise, like we have a system which is partly based on post-colonial structures. We have trade systems that are beneficial for certain people but exploit other people. And if you don't kind of make sure that the poorest in the poorest countries have a decent minimum living standard first, then tackling inequality, climate change in these countries won't be possible either. And the last point is the empowerment turnaround, as we call it, to particularly give education and jobs to women, which is related to a normative factor, because I feel like, in 2022 in Germany, women who have the exact same job still get like 8% less money than men, which is just a normative question, just not understandable, but also related to this population issue I mentioned before. The more education and the more social security systems are there, the faster the birth rates decline.
Yeah, that's I think that's very fascinating. So we're already seeing, the declining birth rates. And I just actually had the pleasure of speaking with Mark Jacobson, which is an environmental engineer at the University of Stanford. And he wrote a paper. I think it's, I don't remember the name of the paper, John, so maybe help me out here. But he'll find it. Basically, the Green New Deal is they borrowed a lot of the ideas that he wrote, and there are currently, I think, we could get 145 countries on all renewable energy by 2030. And I think there are like 15 or 16 that are almost completely green. And I know Denmark comes to mind. So we are definitely trending in the right direction. You have a lot of companies such as like Redwood Materials. You have Tesla that is making widestream, and Rivian as well, widestream adoption of electric vehicles more feasible and affordable. So when I look at the climate change, I think that another issue that a lot of people have is it's been so doom and gloom, and it's really hard to convince people to turn around if all they're hearing is we're all gonna die. I mean, we are gonna die anyways, but like the planet's dying and we're screwed. Like there's a lot of hope out there. There's a lot of really cool things that are coming on, and I was wondering, does the book highlight any of that?
Very much, and good points. So one tagline we have in the book is we call this stubborn optimism, to exactly refer to these good examples that are already out there. Because I agree. I mean, there is an energy transformation happening. I'm sure we are in the end game of fossil fuel industries. It just it's still around, and the crucial question is if it will happen fast enough, because it is a race with time. Because we know that climate change is not only an issue that develops kind of linearly when you have like more CO2, temperature rises as much as that as well, but there is a challenge of certain kind of tipping points that after crossing certain amounts of CO2, for example, the system tips quicker than we would expect in a linear way. And I think the question there is then, are we fast enough for the energy transformation to take place? We have the positive examples, mostly in countries that have good, conditions in terms of sun or water or all these things. So it's more difficult in other countries than in others. But good examples are out there. But I think sometimes we also need to ask bigger questions. For example, if we speak about electric cars, I think it's a good example. We need these, and we need electric cars. However, we can't just replace all combustion engines with electric cars, right? And I think that's sometimes the issue of like looking at things that are not just kind of within the same system, replacing one thing by the other, but looking at the real transformation. And that is an important point, also referring to your doom argument, which I agree with. I mean, it's, it can lead to resistance or kind of people saying, oh, we don't have a chance anymore anyways, we just die and we don't do anything. So I think it's super important to paint a little bit this positive vision and say like it is possible. And maybe an interesting factor there is even, I think it would even be beneficial for people if climate change wasn't there at all. Like a transformation of cities, for example. How great is it to be in a city where you don't rely only on car traffic, but can walk and take a bike? I mean, that's in itself a fantastic thing, right? Education for women in itself a great thing. Like having less pollution and maybe not gigantic plastic continents in the oceans is itself a positive outcome. And I think all these things to say like it is possible, and the better life is not only necessary because we want to prevent climate change, but actually because we established a system which doesn't deliver an always better life for everyone anymore. Like we had this narrative in the US, it's very much the American dream, and in Germany it's there's like and in many other countries, I want my children to have a better life than I have. We see that this empirically is not in many countries true anymore. We see that from the growth of the economy in the last 20 years, low and medium income families did not really benefit from that, but partly have like 3 jobs and have to pay back debts and have a very stressful life. And I think, bringing this together and say like we want an economy that serves the people, and in addition to that, say, fight climate change, but not say everything is lost anyways, but get behind this and say like we want this transformation for our own sake because we want to be happy people. That should be the challenge.
My apologies, my laptop's going to die. So.
It's okay. Rick, so to go back to Mark Jacobson, the paper that you're referencing is called Low-Cost Solutions to Global Warming, Air Pollution, and Energy Insecurity for 145 Countries. And basically, to summarize it, he, through this study, he's the main author, but there's about 7 or 8 other authors, was that by 2035, using current technology and not anything that has to be developed or things that need to be solved, but literally just the only green technologies that we currently have available, that roughly it would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 trillion a year to convert all of this. But then the cost of that through the savings that would be produced through changing to green technologies would be paid for by itself within like 15 years, I think. And so that like this is kind of talking to the positivity about this is a genuine, like a very solvable problem, but we all actually have to act on it and not just run off of profit motive.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there is a lot of positive. If you look at the decline of costs of solar panels, for example, I mean, it's incredible in the last 10, 15 years even, that it can, in many places already, not globally necessarily, but compete with fossil fuel industry prices. I mean, that's fantastic. And there are positive visions of that. I don't know the specific paper, but we also have an estimation in Earth4All that we think the transformation will cost between 2 to 4% of global GDP annually. If you compare that with what is the NATO agreement on defense, that is 2%, right? I mean, so it is something that is of course a massive transformation, but it's also something that is possible, especially as you mentioned, John, that the costs will equal out at some point, because we already see that I often say that actually the really radical political solution is to continue business as usual, because if we continue this business as usual, then we have the floods in Pakistan that already costs I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars. Then we have kind of other droughts in many countries and problems with food security and extreme weather events and all these things. So it's always this cost question is of course important, because you need investment, and therefore I also think you need a strong state to get this done, because of course, like the private companies play a crucial role, but very often it is they have to, in the system, base their decisions on profitability. And so I think like support by government is necessary to steer the transformation in the right way. But then I agree, it is not impossible. And that was our whole thing in the book as well, to say like, look, it's ambitious, but we don't come up with a dreamy hippie thing, which is just a better world, but something actually to implement.
I hear you. But I definitely think profit's there, because if you look at a lot of these companies, there's some of them are not really startups, and I know off the top of my head I can't name them, but I know if you look at Redwood Materials, they recycle lithium batteries, right, from Teslas. If you look at, I think it's Blue Whale Technologies, I may have gotten that wrong, they're also in the battery recycling business. And there are people there's a lake in California that they're running
the Salton Sea.
Yeah. Yes, basically they convert that to, if they superheat the salt water, it converts to lithium ions or something of that effect. I'm butchering all of this.
Also, don't forget, there's a lot of research being done into alternative sources of lithium, including, I believe it was a study. Yep. Yeah, at the University of Maryland, crab shells using lithium or materials in that to make rechargeable batteries.
Yeah. But there's money to be made, and a lot of the investors, I know that Warren Buffett, especially with that Salt Lake, it's geothermal heating, Warren Buffett owns that. So there's already all this, there's a race I see to become for lack of a better term, the sheiks of clean energy. And there's a lot of money behind it. And I definitely think that that's going to help widespread adoption of these new technologies. So it's interesting to see, definitely just looking at it from an economic perspective and an investment perspective, right? Like we like to give stock tips out on this. Buy clean energy, fools. No, but I just... It's exciting to kind of see the advancements. Even since I was a kid, solar panels, like you gave a great example, solar panels used to be so expensive, and now they're relatively inexpensive. That's going to help with, one of my concerns was with all these electric cars, is that going to put a massive strain on the grid? Well, if we get more adoption in solar panels, not necessarily, we should be good. So there's a lot of interesting... there's a lot of interesting things going on. There's companies in California that are covering streams with these like plastic balls, and that's been a while ago since we interviewed that gentleman. So, John, I need your help there. But there's so much innovation that is happening with these technologies. It's been a joy to kind of keep up to date and watch, and then also it's good that people are writing about it. So I want to continue to hammer this point. Like, it is not all doom and gloom, folks. Like, there's a lot of really cool things that are happening.
Rick, you were referencing Roger Bales. He's a environmental scientist and environmental engineer at the University of California, Merced, and University of Cal Berkeley. Their project is to, I forget what the name of it is, but they're covering the agricultural waterways in Central California with solar panels, since all the waterways already have all of the electricity and everything wired to them, they can cover them, and it will reduce costs for cleaning the waterways. It will increase energy availability and also help with evaporation from the heat.
That's what the blackballs.
Yeah, and I think that is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, a lot of, like, even in the last 10 years, what comes up there in terms of new sources and new solutions. I think what we have to see, though, is that a lot of these innovations are actually also based on initial state funding. So I'm always a bit skeptical when people say, like, oh, like we as companies do that and the state can just stay out of that. Because if you look at Mariana Mazzucato wrote a strong state about a book about the entrepreneurial state and kind of how many innovations, be it chips and phones or whatever, comes actually from initial research of states. So I think there needs to be a better balance between markets and states in this regard. But in addition to that, I think fantastic. Like, if we can set up these markets that lead us into the right direction and have all these innovative things you mentioned and green hydrogen and all these things, that's brilliant. Especially as we could now see in the last months that there are not only what economists then call environmental externalities to fossil fuel stuff, like pollution and all these things we don't want but just come along with extracting these things, but also security externalities. Actually, I mean, I'm in Germany now. We made ourselves very dependent of an autocracy and of Russia. And at the beginning of the war, we had over 50% of the gas import from Russia. I mean, that it's not a smart idea to become completely reliable on a dictatorship could have been an argument already, or people could have noticed that a while ago. But I think now it becomes even more present. And it's interesting how the discourse there also shifts. Like, now the head of the Liberal Party in Germany, which was always like not the front runner of sustainable issues, but he now speaks about renewable energies as freedom energies, because he says we become independent from other states, and there's some truth to it, and I think that all the innovations you mentioned, this will all be necessary to not have this doom and gloom outlook, scenario, and story, which is why we in this Earth4All book also then develop kind of two scenarios, and one is this too little too late, where we just continue with the current trends, and the other one is this giant leap. And the giant leap scenario is actually the one you have in mind there as well, when you say, like, it's not all doom and gloom, but it is actually possible if we put effort into it. I just think we shouldn't pretend that great, we're on the right track and everything will go as now, and then we will solve the problems, especially for the social dimension, which I think we really have to be aware of.
Yes, and let's get into the doom and gloom. We've been real positive. Let's say we just continue on the path that we're on now.
Yeah.
What happens?
I mean, we have in this scenario developed different outcomes. One is we won't get temperature rise under control, which will be about 2.5 degrees in 2100, which does mean way more extreme weather events, which does mean more droughts, which does mean problems for food security, which is, by the way, not only a problem of certain countries. One could think like, oh yeah, Pakistan, they then have their problems, because we in Europe and the US, we have enough funds to adjust ourselves to that and build some dikes and whatever. But of course, in a global system, rising food prices will have outcomes for polarization in the US and Germany. Massive migration waves will, of course, have political consequences in rich countries as well. And so this is one aspect: rising temperature, increased climate change, and thereby problems coming along with it. The second one, that we see inequality rising over the next decades. So we see that trend in the last years. We will continue seeing it, that actually a small minority benefits from our economic system, while many people don't. And that is true both globally, so that people in countries of the global south don't actually get out of this poverty trap, but also that inequality in rich societies increases even more, which then leads to polarization and dysfunctional societies. And I would say that people like Bolsonaro in Brazil are signs of that, or the whole like populist movement across different countries in the world is a sign of that. So I think that is another aspect. And what we then we have in the model, we included a well-being index. So kind of trying to measure, of course, we know it's not completely objective and there are some problems with it, but trying to measure the well-being of people. And I think the trend is quite clear that in this too little too late scenario, well-being will decline and people will feel less content with their life.
I think one of the things you glossed over, which I think would be very interesting to kind of explore more, is if we don't get this under control, I believe that we become a lot less friendly. If we kind of extrapolate that, most of the wars that have been fought have been over resources. And if your country doesn't have enough resources or enough food, the one thing that we've done since time immemorial is we go and we take it. And so I think it's incredibly important to kind of think about that. That's something that I feel like the movement doesn't talk about a lot, is like if we don't figure it out and get a little bit better, there's going to be a lot more global strife and conflict, a lot more wars, and that's never good. And especially if you look at today, the way the world sits, like a lot of people have forgotten this, but I don't think I don't think that there'll be a nuclear war, but like, especially with the increased hostilities in Europe, that we're in danger, right? There's a lot of peril right now. We have a conflict between the West and the East along the likes of which we haven't seen since the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. Like it's definitely not so good, and that would pretty much be the doom of all of us. So I think it's definitely important that we do develop these technologies so you don't have to be so dependent on these nations.
Very, very, very much. And exactly, like, good point, because what I said before was kind of the polarization within countries. But of course, like, there is already a paradigm shift going on for how policy making goes beyond countries, because I would say it's not even a conflict only between East and West anymore, but a multipolar world where we have now the conflict with Russia, but I mean, look at China. We don't know what that's going to lead to, and I think that this instability is actually dangerous. Like, I don't believe in a nuclear war myself as well, but if we come into this time where we are actually faced with scarce resources, and countries want to get what they think they need, then the tensions will rise, and this kind of there's this political scientist Fukuyama who said, like, 20 years ago, the end of history, like the Western liberal model of democracies will win. I'm not so sure. I mean, we don't know, because we are faced now with a situation where China, which is an autocracy, not a democracy, is highly functional in that sense, right? I mean, it's not like you could say back then in the USSR. Of course, they were the poor; they had no productivity. It was clear that this system would come to an end one day. Now we actually do have a competition of different governance models, and yeah,
That's a good point. I like to stay here because this is something I find very, very interesting. If you look at what Xi Jinping's doing, there's a lot of environmental initiatives that China's doing to clean up and to get sustainable, but also there's a stark difference in the way these countries, like both systems, work. You have one country, the Chinese, right? They are ran by essentially engineers and scientists. They really do listen. And then, I don't know, I can't speak so much about the German political, but in the United States, we're governed by lawyers. we're governed by lawyers, so it's really hard to get things done. And if you look at the production numbers of China, they're we're still beating them a little bit, but I don't know how much longer we will be the world's largest economy. And I don't know what what the future looks like, because there's a lot of, and I'm getting way in the weeds here, but there's a lot of right now, I don't know if you would know this, but we are blocking their access to a lot of technologies. We're quietly sanctioning them. And the most interesting thing that I've seen is we're now forcing European countries to stop doing business with them. How long that is able to last, I don't know. But I don't know. And that's another thing is, there's a lot of contracts being rewarded because we've been behind them for probably about the last 20, 30 years in the development of Africa. They're way ahead of us. Very forward-thinking society,
Also,
and that's
just announced, I believe, within the last week that the ban on the sale and import of Chinese or something. It's like some restrictions on Chinese imports of conductor chips
yes.
for computers and things, and we have no manufacturing capacity at all. There's been investment. I think it was Intel is building like a $15 billion factory in Ohio.
Yes.
And I believe AMD is building something as well in California or somewhere in the United States, but those plants are still 15 to 20 years away from reaching the kind of capacity that we would need to be able to sustain any kind of development.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, first of all, also Germany is governed by lawyers. If you look at the Bundestag and the parliament, it is mostly lawyers there, which is also an issue in terms of representation. But yeah, it is an interesting time, because I feel like the certain paradigms are just crashing at the moment. We always have the belief that more globalization is leading to we always just have the advantages in certain countries and have chip production. 20 years ago, there would not have been this quiet ban, and now there is a tendency to localize certain things even more and go back. And at the same time, China is, of course, expanding also its political reach. Look at the Belt and Road Initiative. No, what is it called? Belt and Road. So there is like a tendency that the political power games increase, and I have no idea where this leads to. I
don't either.
It's an interesting time.
I don't either. And this is what's so fascinating to me, because I'm looking at the geopolitical landscape, and I'm like, are we at the beginning of? Are we in, I don't know, the 1936, 1937 right now, where everyone's incredibly hostile, everyone's quietly making moves? China's really trying to facilitate their soft power and their reach. I don't know. I don't know, and it's not something that we're not paying attention over here, man. We're definitely not. But it's all tied to certain things, right? It really is tied to the environment. A lot of the dispute on the waters between Japan and China have to do with fishing rights, right? Like, everything is boiled down to resources, which I think your book has done a good job of making sure that that's present. And there's also an issue with like soil degradation, like we're fucking the soil up, and there's so many issues, and there's so much to pay attention to, and it's really hard to figure out what's the most important thing, man. There's so much. There's so many things that are grabbing our attention. Most people are concerned about what's trending on Twitter or friggin' Instagram or whatever, but there's really, really important issues that are being discussed. And I don't know about you, but the thing that scares me is they're being discussed and decisions are being made by people that don't necessarily understand the science behind, these things.
No, that I would agree with, and I mean the general, like what people call now kind of polycrisis, all these different crises coming together, and then that's again coming back to this Club of Rome attempt to have a systemic view and not focus on particular issues only, but see, like, if you zoom out, what can you see then? Although even with that view, I have to say I'm a bit lost when I look at the international level at the moment, because I think it is really unstable, unpredictable, and not clear what's going to happen. So I think what we can do is kind of focus on the positive outcomes and say, like, look, these turnarounds we describe, we think these are also contributing to a more global, secure space, and that this is a positive contribution. But we, of course, don't have any predictions in that.
No.
And yeah.
What I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on nuclear energy?
Yeah, I think it's a contested topic for the reason I think probably if 30 years ago the climate change would have been taken as serious as it's being taken now, we would still have nuclear, and instead of coal, we would have phased out coal before nuclear. So I think that in that sense, if you look at emissions, then coal is really harmful, and we have to know that. So that is an issue, and then I think it really depends on the country level. Like following the German discourse, I think it really doesn't make much sense at the moment anymore. We have like three nuclear power plants. Building these things takes forever. You need massive investment. The state actually has to take over the insurance, and there are of course these negative externalities. Like the stuff like what you put. It's kind of scary to have something where you don't have to store it for 100,000 years. I feel like that's not the most sustainable way of doing it. But of different bad alternatives, I understand that this is an alternative some people recognize. And I think moving forward, though, also looking at the price decline and what we discussed before, I think it just won't make sense anymore in the future. Because I think that solar, wind, all these things will have a price advantage even. Yeah. That's my take.
I agree. When I start thinking about, especially the sun, we're going to get a little bit woo-woo here, but I think that we have to figure out a way to get off the planet. I think we need to be a multiplanetary species. And are you familiar with the Kardashev scale by chance?
No.
Okay. So basically there's like types of civilization. Like type 1, I'm going to butcher this. So John, look this up and make sure.
You mean the energy circle kind of thing? Is it that thing?
Yes, pretty much. We have to figure, this is why I'm a big proponent of all of this, is like we have to figure out how to harness the power of the sun, like completely to power our civilization. We have to do that so we can become a level 1 civilization. I think that leads us into the stars. That's really, I think, if you look at giant cataclysmic events that have occurred in the past, and I don't know, we did a missile test on an asteroid, but that's something that's looming. It's happened before. It'll probably happen again. You look at the giant caldera in Yellowstone. Like, I feel like we really got to get off this rock to ensure the survival of our species. Not only that, we're also kind of killing the earth and the oceans and soil shit, and maybe just need to start over. So I'm a very big proponent in these technologies because in order for us to really get to the stars, I think that we have to, harness the full power of the sun. And so anything that drives us closer to that is something I'm a proponent of, because we're a very crazy species, and we have a bunch of civilization ending weapons all pointed at each other. It's just not a good rock to be on right now. We got to get off, man. But
I mean, the question is if we wouldn't just transfer our power struggles we have on Earth now to power struggles between Mars and Earth later, right? Because I think
we probably would.
Systemic issues we have here, and short-term consequences of not acting now is of course so high that this is not an option. Still, I like I like the idea from a kind of fantasy perspective or whatever, but I think the feasibility, scaling up, all these things. In terms of solving the immediate crises, I would say focus on Earth. We have a quite nice planet here, and then see what happens with the rest of space afterwards, after we have solved these crises. But at the same time, I think that there are certain systemic issues we have, and there's power struggles and resource wars and all these things. Maybe then your vision leads to the year 2200, where the civilization on Mars developed a super weapon to not only destroy cities on Earth, but let's say, we just let's switch off Earth completely. So no, the future is unpredictable.
It's true.
But yeah.
I've got one more question for you, and what do you think is the most important systemic issues that we're dealing with now? And then the second part would be, how do you think would be a best way or the best solution to fix it?
Yeah. So I think like what we try with these 5 turnarounds is, of course, to say all of them have to happen at the same time. And I know that's not an answer to your question, but that's a thing of saying like, look, we need to look at all these things. I would say, if you ask me directly, like what becomes a big issue now is kind of this tackling climate change paid by the rich. I think that would be the summary, because you have, it is an existential challenge with potential to solve it, but don't let the poor pay it by default, and let's implement social systems that actually make sure that those who contributed to the pollution, as well those who benefited from the system, also are the ones paying for the transformation, and that would be my main point.
Till, I really appreciate you coming on this podcast, man. It was really fun talking to you. I enjoyed it. I've learned a lot, and I think we have a chance. I really think we have a chance, man.
I think so too. Thank you. That was great.
Yeah.
And thanks, Rick. Thanks, John.